So we talked about obedience. So when we're talking about obedience, that's Milgram's study. And now we're going to be talking about conformity, which is Ash's experiment. So Solomon Asch, I believe. So conformity occurs when a person adjusts their thoughts, emotions, or behaviors to agree with an individual or group. This is something that we discuss quite a lot in high school. Conformity, you might conform to try fit in and be a part of a certain group at school. You might conform and undertake a particular behavior that even though you don't agree with it, you conform because you might, for example, want to fit into the group. And again, we said it occurs when someone adjusts their thoughts, emotions, or behaviors to agree with an individual or group. And we'll talk about and discuss some ideas of why this happens a little bit later. So have a look at this here. So we have this line on this card here, and then we have lines A, B, and C. What would you say if I asked you which line on this card is the same length as this line here? And now what if I said, if you were in a room with like 10 other people and they all said line A is the correct answer, would you conform and say line A as well? You would probably say that you wouldn't, and of course not. And some people wouldn't. Most of us would say that we wouldn't. But the interesting thing is, well, but what about if you were in an experiment many, many years ago and you didn't know that it was an experiment about conformity? The participants in Ash's experiment were told that this was a study about visual perception. So they were like tricked. They were in a room, for example, with a whole bunch of other people. And then like they said, okay, well, which line on this card, A, B, or C, is the same as this one? And everyone else in the room said A. For example, that's just an example that I'm giving. And then the participant who wasn't in on it, who didn't actually know what was going on, a lot of the time, more often than we would think, they would just be like, oh, and they would just go along with it and say A as well. And that would be an example of conforming because they knew that A was not the correct answer, but they adjusted their thoughts, emotions, or behaviors to agree with the group, maybe because they felt pressured, or we'll have a look at some other examples shortly. But again, they said a different response even though it wasn't actually what they thought. So like I said, the Confederates, like the other people, were planted to give the wrong answer and see if the participants would conform. And 74% of people conformed at least once. And the mean conformity rate was 33%, which I think is like quite high for people to give an answer that they know is wrong just because everybody else gave a different answer. And we see this in high school quite a lot, or in primary school, in every setting of life. For example, I heard a story a while ago about a teacher that put up a Where's Wally sheet on the board with, I think it was like a year 3 class or something. And the teacher said, okay, I want you to find the Where's Wally, and when you do, don't say anything, don't point, but once you have found the Where's Wally, I want you to go over to that side of the room and take your seat. And what they noticed in this story, this isn't like a real experiment, I think it's just like one of those stories that gets passed around, but one by one, the kids would go and take their seat. One, and then a few other kids took their seat, then slowly, the whole class had taken their seat. But then the teacher said, like, why did you take your seat? And the teacher actually revealed that there actually wasn't a Where's Wally in the thing. It had been a setup. And that illustrates the point that instead of all of the kids going like, we can't find it, where is it? One kid probably, maybe for example, they didn't want to feel like dumb. Maybe they wanted to appear smart. Whatever was motivating them, they went and they took their seat. And then another kid's like, oh, like that kid's going and taking their seat. Maybe I should too. So they went as well. And then one by one, they all conformed and did it, even though they hadn't found Wally. So that's just an example, which is a bit similar in some ways to this study here. So let's talk about now factors that influence conformity. So these are factors that they speculated might have been at play in Ash's study, and these are also factors that could have been at play in that little Where's Wally example story. And the summary of all this is pretty much that groups are very powerful in influencing behavior. And again, that can be for better or worse. People are very influential, which is why we study it in psychology. So factors influencing conformity. So the first one they identified, people conformed because they wanted to belong to the group. So group identity and that sense of belonging is actually like a very, very important thing that's like intrinsically valuable to people. We want to be a part of groups. So if, for example, you're in a group of friends and everyone says, oh, like we want to go get fish and chips for lunch, but you want to go and get, I don't know, for example, McDonald's for lunch. In this example, it's saying that you'd conform and say, oh, me too, because you want to belong to your friendship group. You don't want to feel different. You don't want to be the odd one out. Like we want to belong. Like that's a natural desire that we have. Next is unanimity. So even one person disagreeing with the group consensus can make a big difference. So what this means here is if you're the only one going against the flow, like that's really hard and scary. So if you're the only one, you're more likely to conform. But if there's even just one other person who's going against the tide, that can decrease conformity by 80%. So if in my example earlier, if everyone said it's A, but then if the one other person spoke out the right answer, this says that that would give you the confidence to then say that that would give you the right answer, and that could decrease conformity by 80%, which is crazy. So again, we don't want to be the only one. And again, that links in with it. We want to belong to the group, and that's a very natural thing. Another thing is the group size. So it's scarier to disagree in larger groups. If you're in a group of like 100 other people and everyone said 1 + 1 is 3, like we all know that's wrong. But because it's like a large group, you might feel like more like, oh, I'm not going to say anything because it's a big group. But if it's you and 2 other people, you're much more likely to speak your mind. But that's what they found in this study at least. Also, de-individuation was an interesting thing. So that's when you lose your individuality and become part of the group. And conformity is stronger when we're responsible for our responses. So if, for example, coming back to, again, the example with Ash's experiment, if you were sitting in the room with 10 other people and everyone else said A is the correct answer, if you then had to speak up and say the answer that you think or that you know is the right answer, you then have to be individually responsible for that answer. Like everyone's going to look at you and like that's kind of scary and like nobody wants that. But when they did like a variation of the study and they got people to give their answers in a booth, so that actually decreased conformity as well. Is what people would do is that, oh, I can just like write down my answer on a piece of paper, hand it in, and no one else has to know it was me that like went against the crowd. Like even though I know like, you know, what other people have said, if you write down your answer, it's like, okay, I'm not individually accountable for that. No one has to know it was me. I can say whatever I want. Then that decreases conformity, which makes sense. And I think that actually has a really interesting link to the Stanford prison experiment. Because what they did in the Stanford prison experiment is they de-individualized the guards by giving them the sunnies and the uniforms and the batons. And they de-individualized the guards by the prisoners by giving them these like hairnets and little smocks. And they did that again for the guards to like reduce their inhibitions about doing cruel things, and they did it to the prisoners to like reduce their sense of self and just blend them into the group because they wanted to study these group dynamics, so they wanted to strengthen the group rather than an individual identity. So I find that link just kind of interesting, the idea of whether there's a greater focus on ourselves or our identity within the group, how that can kind of influence behavior. Because again, groups are very powerful in influencing behavior. Next was culture. So conformity is lower in individualistic cultures. So, for example, like cultures, a lot of Western cultures and countries have very individualistic cultures. It's very, I own this, you do that, this is me, I don't need you, like almost that kind of culture. There is definitely still a large emphasis on groups and group identity, even in very individualistic cultures. But they did find that conformity, or they speculated or found that conformity is lower in individualistic cultures. And that makes sense, because in cultures that have a very, very large emphasis on like more group identity, that could definitely influence conformity. And you can see how that would happen. Next one, social loafing. So that's the idea that it's easier to go with the group. Like, oh, well, maybe that wasn't the answer that popped into my mind at first, but I don't care. I don't want to have to think about the right answer. I'll just go with what everybody else says. You can definitely see that sometimes as well. Whereas if the majority thinks one thing, it's a lot easier to just go with the flow than to think of your own opinion. So, for example, in like a true or false scenario in school, if they said, please walk to that side if you believe this, please walk to that side if you believe this. If you like weren't listening or just like didn't care, then you'd probably just go where everyone else went, because that's social loafing. It's easier to just go with the flow than put in some effort. But that doesn't actually reveal that it's not actually helpful. Second last, informational influence. So, for example, if you're not certain of your response, so we assume others are better informed. And then there's also normative influence. So go with the flow to fit in with the group. So again, that's kind of linked to our social loafing, and not so much the social loafing, more so the belonging. So that like we want to fit in. And then that informational influence is about like, ooh, like all of these other people are saying A, like what if I'm actually wrong? Like there's that kind of idea.